The last page, the last section I'm going to read is from later on in the book. And they're trying to find a way to unenchant one of the magic kingdoms that has been enchanted early and caused all kinds of problems. And so they're looking for some way of getting in and out of the Sleeping Beauty's country really quickly. So they're looking for something. They're looking for a magic saddle that will take them anywhere that they want really, really fast. And they're wandering through the woods, and they come upon this rather odd place. These clearings were bright oases of sunlight in the dark woods. They were filled with bright flowers and butterflies. Many of them had tiny springs in them, which made them perfect campsites. It was in one of these clearings that they found the tiny little hut. The occupant was the smallest, most wrinkled person that any of them had ever seen. She was dressed in a dusty black with a white apron. The old woman welcomed them with a toothless grin. "Hello, dearies," she said. "Come and have a sip of water with me. I can tell you are tired and thirsty." Indeed, as she spoke, the three felt such exhaustion they could hardly remain standing, and their throats were parched and dry. Alexandra held up a hand to stop her companions from rushing for the water dipper. "Wait." She dropped her pack and fumbled for a moment. "We haven't much to offer in return for your hospitality, ma'am, but the last of our bread." She held out a crust to the old woman and hoped that she had remembered her history books correctly. My, you are a polite girl." Alex wasn't sure if it was anger or pleasure on that wrinkled face. "Thank you, dearie. I will enjoy your bread. You are welcome to my water without obligation." The pressure of exhaustion and thirst faded. The cold, clear water vanished, the last of it. "Perhaps you would care to share my fire for the night," asked their host, "and work their uncles out." She winked at the trio. "I've nothing to offer in exchange for your hospitality," said Herbert, following Alexandra's cue. "Is there some small chore I could do to help you out?" The wrinkled old woman made what Herbert was sure was a pretense of thinking about his question. "Well, aren't you a dear? There is a wee bit of wood out back which could use some splitting. You can have at that. Only be sure to finish it before sundown." Herbert nodded and headed around the back of the tiny hut. Alexandra watched him with a small frown on her face and her fingers crossed. If she was right, the prince was in for a shock. The old woman was all the gracious host now as she waved the remaining two into her hut. Herbert rounded the corner of the house to be faced with the largest pile of wood that he had ever seen. The axe was a monster that he could barely lift. Stifling a groan, he hefted the axe and began splitting the logs. Fortunately, he thought, she hadn't asked him to stack the wood as well. The logs were oak and heavy as iron. Still, Herbert kept at his task until his hands were blistered and raw from the unaccustomed labor. When the sky started turning dark as the sun lowered towards the horizon, he had barely made a dent in the immense pile. The prince was moving only by dogged determination. Just as he was ready to despair, he heard a tiny voice calling for help. Throwing down the axe, he looked around. A huge black cat had caught a mouse and was playing with it. It was the mouse who was calling for help. Herbert snatched the mouse up and held it away from the cat, who hissed at the prince and slashed his leg. Then it turned as if nothing had happened, and stalked off. "Thank you," squeaked the mouse. "Is there anything I can do for you?" "Unless you can split all this wood, I don't think so," Herbert said. "Why don't you go get a drink, and I'll see what I can do." The prince shrugged and staggered around the front to the well. As soon as he rounded the corner, he heard a sound like 1,000 axes chopping. He dipped out some water and took a long drink. The water was the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. It coursed cool and wet down his throat, soothing and refreshing him. He splashed some on his hands, and they immediately stopped their burning. When the sound stopped, he leaped back to the woodpile and stopped in amazement. All the wood had been split and stacked neatly. "I don't know how to thank you," Herbert said. "It's a small thing in return for my life," replied the mouse, who darted into the woodpile. Herbert picked up the axe and leaned it against the house. "I do like to see a good worker," said the old woman. "Come into the house and have a bite to eat. You have earned it." The prince followed her into the house. Alexandra gasped as she saw Herbert's legs covered with blood. He just gazed down at them in surprise, and they began to burn. "Oh dear, my cat must have split your stilts." She winked at him. "Come here and I'll wrap them up." As he hesitated, she laughed. "'Tis free, boy. I don't play games in blood." She carefully wrapped his legs in clean white linen, and as the cloth and touched him, it drained the pain away. The four of them ate supper in silence. "Well, my dears, it's time for bed. I need my beauty sleep." She laughed madly at her own humor. "Surely, Gran," said Jock, rubbing his ankle, "there was some small chore that I could do. I feel quite left out. I'm the only one who hasn't made some small return for your hospitality." The old woman gazed at the big man for a moment, and then she smiled. "You can bring in my cat." Jock looked doubtfully at Herbert's legs, but pushed himself to his feet and went outside. He expected to have to search for the beast, but it was waiting for him lying on the huge splitting block. Carefully, Jock approached the cat, ready to leap away from striking claws. But the great black cat just flopped over and lay bonelessly on the stump. When he tried to lift it, Jock grunted in surprise. He couldn't budge it in the least. "Don't take all night, boy, just bring him in." Jock growled at the cat and tried to lift it again. The cat just purred. Gasping, he leaned on the block and almost fell when it rocked under him. "Don't play with him now." The old woman's voice was sharp and angry. Jock didn't know if she was talking to him or the cat. He didn't care. No cat was going to best him. He bent his arm down and put his arms around the massive block and lifted it with a roar. He swore later that the cat looked shocked. Turning around, his joints popping, Jock carried the block and the cat into the house. He carefully put the block down beside the fire. "I thought you might be needing a little bit of wood for the fire, seeing as bringing in the cat was such a small thing." The hut rang with the old woman's laughter. "Such a heroic thing. Be careful you don't get too big for your skin." She winked at him. "I haven't had so much fun in ages. I'll give you a little gift before you go. Mind you, it's old. You may only use it 3 times, but you may find it a help." She waved them up to the loft. "Do you know a short little fellow with red hair and a bad temper?" asked Alexandra, holding her breath. "Surely I do, and a scoundrel he is," the old woman answered. "Do you know his name?" "Ah, that would be telling," said the old woman with a wink. Alexandra kissed her wrinkled cheek. "Thank you." She followed the other two up to the loft.